welcome to Vermont Film Essentials. My name is David Metzger.
I'm Lincoln L. Hayes. We have a guest this week.
Very excited.
Hello.
Nathan Hartswick, welcome to the show.
Thank you, guys. Well, thanks for having me.
Absolutely.
Oh, it's so fun to be at this table.
Finally.
He comes in and he's like, I didn't realize it was tall.
For the longest time I wanted to ask you, but you're so busy then I was like, I don't know if he'd say yes.
I always say yes to movie-related things, especially if it takes me away from things I have to do, so I can talk about movies. Absolutely.
And what a movie we chose.
Yep.
I know.
But for a good cause.
Yes.
And that cause is because we're having a screening of it tonight. And I'm very excited about it. But by the time you see this, that'll already happen, so whatever.
So you're promoting things in the past?
Yes. Just like the films that we watch. We're promoting the past.
Oh, I see. We're all
nostalgic.
living in the past, I think, in some way.
This was my first viewing of this film. When did you first see this?
I was trying to think about it. I think in college, I had a pretty limited movie viewing before that. Like in high school and middle school and stuff, I grew up in a small town with no cable, and so it was in the days of like the VHS rental place, and every VHS rental was an event. So you had to everyone in the family had to agree on what it was.
Yes.
So more often we would rent Dunstan Checks In.
Because we all like that one.
Right, because everyone can enjoy that rather than something like this. So I think...
You mean Manchurian Candidate wasn't
it
a
wasn't,
go-to
no,
movie
I don't
for your
think it
family
was.
movie night?
And I remember that there was in my college town, there was a video store that had the 7 movies for 7 days for $7 kind of thing. And I think I probably, when I started, having the time to sit around my dorm room exploring new films, I think this is when this came up, and it just kind of blew my mind a little bit. So what about you?
Same thing, so it was in college, and yeah, it was one of the, it was always in the film books that I would read, and I knew it was a film that was there waiting for me. But I can't remember if it was first year or second year of college, but yeah, grabbed it from the school library, went home, and was just like, what is this movie? How is this movie so good? And really, and just so modern. If I was gonna this is a strange comparison, but the Beatles song "Tomorrow Never Knows," it's a movie that you put in, and it's just how did this come out in '62?
Right.
And how does it still feel so fresh?
Right.
And especially rewatching it today, it's scary because it's today.
Yeah. it's very creepy. I remember when the remake came out in 2004, and I was like, oh, okay, this looks interesting. Then I learned that it was a remake. And then I learned that Frank Sinatra was in the original. It's just like, what? How does any of this make any sense?
Where David and I probably had the opposite reaction, which is, oh, come on, it's such a perfect film as it is. Why do you have to remake that?
Exactly, because I didn't know about...
And refused to see the remake.
Right. Yeah, and I didn't see it either. Yeah. It was just like, oh, neat, remake, Sinatra.
I did just because it was Jonathan Demme, and I was like, it can't be that bad if Jonathan Demme did it. And they they did their best of trying to update it, but at the same time, you're just like, why didn't you just, update it and create something new rather than just using that moniker of the original.
But anywho, the original, which we watched, this was fantastic. This was, and the second we get into the brainwashing scene, I was so surprised that we were even seeing it, because I thought that was going to be a mystery that we unraveled. But no, it's right there on Front Street. It's like, this is what's happening. And then you have the intercutting of the 3 different versions of the same scene, where at first you're listening to this woman talk about flowers, and you're like, why are they all there? Aren't they in a POW camp? What's going on? And then it all pieces itself together and creates this insane montage. And I was enthralled. I was so hooked from that scene. It was just like, okay, this is gonna be great.
It's remarkably done. It's so, the editing is so fantastic in it. It's just first of all, I love anything that does something like that, where I know it's not all one shot or anything, but I love the sort of practical special effect type of thing, where they'll take a camera around, and then in the background a couple different actors are coming in and sitting down in a chair so they can grab the next pass around. I love that kind of stuff, and it was so beautifully done. And then they shoot it in 2 or 3 different locations and cut it all together. And for something made in 1962. That's a remarkable kind of, you look at that, and maybe there'd be a little smoother dolly and like maybe one bit of CGI or something, but for right now it would go the same way.
You could very easily make the same way. Scene. And Tarantino has aped this kind of thing in his films, where he just sets up a scene and just has the camera rotate around it and shoot all of it. And the way that they did this was they did it 3 different ways. And Sinatra is somewhat famous for being kind of like a one-take kind of guy. So a lot of times the take that he did first was the one that they used, because after that his performance wouldn't be as great, admittedly, and he would say that himself. But they did this once with all the women in the Rotary, then they did it again with the guy.
All the white women in the Rotary.
All the white women in the Rotary.
Yeah.
And then they did it in the other room. So they just did it 3 times and then cut all those 3 pieces together.
Right.
It's so simple.
And a couple things about it, like you're right, like it's so, the camera work and the editing is so fluid, but then just to put it in a little bit into historical context, so like Hitchcock in 1960 does Psycho, and then 1962 Kubrick does Lolita. So film is already starting to move, like let's get away from this pre-code, not allowed to show things, and like let's deal with the violence, let's deal with some of the sexual tension and everything. So this film comes out and like it's like nobody dealt with PTSD in this way at this time.
Yeah.
And the beauty about that scene is that at first you're very confused, and then all of a sudden you're just like you're inside the mind of someone who has PTSD and who's having these haunting visions, and you get it. And it's so amazing that in 1962 that happened.
Yeah.
And the killing of Bobby is
it's brutal.
It's brutal. It's shocking, and and you don't expect it. Like you don't expect that level of violence and that like him. You know, I'm sure they had him like on a rope, and they pull the rope and he falls back like that. But then just like the splash of blood on the wall, and you're just like, and of course, like, and then you're in the head of the person in the next scene that's waking up screaming, and you get what he's screaming about, and it's just so well done.
Yeah, and you do have to wonder if you were an audience member watching that in 1962, it must have been shocking. It might have been even hard to follow, because that type of storytelling and editing, it feels so normal to us now, but to see that then, it must have been, it must have been jarring. You know?
Yeah. A lot of people probably walked out going, I don't understand what just happened in that movie.
Before we even get to that moment, like I was just so I was so mesmerized rewatching it. At the first like 8 to 10 minutes of the movie, it is such efficient storytelling. There's none of that like really long kind of slow thing you get that modern audiences, when you look back at a film of this era, oftentimes you get bored sometimes. Like it's like, okay, I don't need to see him get out of the car and drive go all the way up to the doorstep and ring the doorbell. And it packs so much information. Like we meet we meet Raymond as the sort of hard boss in the theater of war quickly. Then we see the ambush where they throw him on the helicopters and helicopter away. Then there's a credit sequence, and then we see him like getting his Medal of Honor, and we meet his mother and his stepdad, and we get all the political aspirations. That's in the first 8 minutes of the movie. Yeah. And you're like, okay, I know exactly what's happening. Yeah. Everything that's going to follow is going to come from that 8 minutes. So it was just such a beautiful, it's such beautiful, efficient storytelling. Cool.
And all the Korean War stuff, like, there's no question what's going on. You get it. Like, the first shot. Although I had to download a new Blu-ray player program for my computer for some reason, and every time I play a Blu-ray, it immediately plays the commentary track. So the movie starts and Frankenheimer's talking, and I was like, "What? No, stop! No, I don't want to know. Don't tell me. I don't know the movie yet." So
no spoilers.
I lost a little bit in the beginning, frantically trying to change my settings. But yeah, you get there, and then of course all the guys are talking about what a hard ass he is, and you understand who all these characters are before you even know who their names are. And then you're right, we're right there getting off the plane, and the press is there, and you're like, okay, this is a big deal. And then, oh, he doesn't like his stepfather, and no, this is okay, I got it. It's all right there. And then we get the amazing scene with the brainwashing and everything else, and you're just like, holy cow. Yeah. You are on a ride from the beginning of this film.
Yeah.
And it shifts in between so many different tones and is able to do so many different things. Like it's darkly comic, the political satire is it's biting, it's dead serious, but it's also kind of like it has a very almost kind of like a Rosemary's Baby type thing where you're not sure if you should be laughing or taking this too seriously, but then a scene comes along and like you're like, no, we should take it seriously.
Yeah. You also don't know if what you're seeing is real.
Right.
Like Rosemary's Baby, we're like, is she? I don't know. You're following along with the protagonist of the story, but you're not entirely sure if the protagonist is right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that's great about it is eventually we get to this romance between Raymond, and sorry I blanked on her name, but the senator's daughter.
Yeah. Right? Starts with a J.
I hate that. Right. But
let's call her Jennifer.
Jennifer. So, but you get this sequence, and it's romantic. It's almost romantic in a very sentimental, like you know, meet cute type of way.
Yeah.
And you're like, and that is able to live, and not like you don't look at it and go, well, that just took me out because this is just sloppy,
schmaltzy.
And it's able to just live there. You're able to just shift into this romance.
Well, because you kind of want to know why Raymond's character is so hard, and when you start to see a softer side of him, it endears you to him a little more. Right about the time when you're about to check out on him.
Yeah.
It's like, wait, hang on a second. This guy is worth, and then, ultimately what happens later, it makes it hurt that much more for an audience. You know?
And that is just, like, one of my favorite things. So when I got the Blu-ray, sat down, Robin's going to watch it for the first time, and we watch it, and she is not the biggest fan of Frank Sinatra.
Right.
So she's going in it like, I don't
arms crossed.
This, right?
There we go.
And the movie ends. And like she doesn't like move. She doesn't give she doesn't show her cards while we're watching the movie. Movie ends and she's just like, I didn't expect that. And I'm just like, yes.
Yeah.
But yeah, like the what happens to the senator and the daughter, it's just
yeah.
And you're just like, what?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't watched this movie in a very long time. I did, it was one of those things, I think, going back to the thing about the rental store, I think I had two VCRs in my dorm room, and I think I copied that movie because I loved it so much.
Good for you.
Yeah, I think
bad for you.
I think the statute of limitations is probably up on any
also, if you have copied VHSs, what are you going to do with them?
What are you gonna
Who's
do
got a
with
VHS
you
player?
can have them. But I had that one for the longest time. So I watched it, many times when I was younger, but not for a very long time. And so the things in my head that pop out before I watched it again that were like the things I remember, that's the big one. The moment that happens when you realize, oh, he's been given the directive that if anyone else is present, they must also be eliminated. Like when that plays out in the worst possible scenario, it's
and
heartbreaking.
You forget about it.
I remember seeing it for the first time going, oh no, because you're so invested at that point.
That's introduced so much earlier in the film that when it happens, and with Homeland and 24 and all the other shows and movies that we have now, obviously he has to tie up loose ends. But you've forgotten that that's part of his directive back when he's in the fake hospital.
Right.
And then it plays off in the end, and you're just like, oh no.
Yeah. And it happens so quickly and so without any kind of if this were happening in a movie today, you'd see her walking down the stairs, you would hear music, he would be in the kitchen talking, you'd hear her coming down, going, what's going on? They would build to that so that you knew what was going to happen.
Yeah.
The whole way.
It's tragic from the moment he gets in the door, as opposed to, oh no, why is she there?
Right.
The surprise that she shows up, you're like, no!
Like it's just a conversation between him and the dad, and then he does what he's there for, and suddenly, oh, she's right behind him.
Yep.
And boom, he's got to do what he's got to do. And the whole thing happens so quickly, and so it makes it that much more sort of jarring for an audience. It's so much more it just ripped your heart out.
And there is no, like you said, there is no build to it, and the details of it, the way that violence is done in this movie is just so. It's so quick, and there's always something. And John Frankenheimer says that he learned this from Kurosawa, but there's some little detail about the violence. So, with Bobby, it's the splash of blood. With that, he's holding the milk carton, and the milk carton just spills out, right? He's got the bullet in it, and that's all you need.
Yeah. And with her, it's that low angle with her in the wave background, and you see her fall. Yeah, it's all very.
And from that angle, you can't even tell that it's a headshot.
Right.
And then when he passes her and you see her, you're like, and it's that much more tragic because you just shot your wife. head.
The only person to ever make you make a joke in your whole life, make you happy in your whole life.
And you from the hip.
Yeah. That's awful. But I understand. Like the violence is very pointed, and it always has some greater emotional impact than just violence.
Right.
And there's only 4 moments of that in the whole movie. So when those things happen, they matter, and they matter to us as an audience emotionally, and they matter to the story. And it's not violence for violence sake at all.
It's interesting too that a lot of the 4 moments, especially, they're not like chapter ends of a book.
Right.
In my head, I'm equating it to things that happened in the last Harry Potter book, where it's a big thing. Something happens, and then you just keep reading, and you're like, what do you mean that's not the end? I have to do more? Like, he just shoots him, and then the wife comes in and he shoots her, and then he leaves, but we don't have a moment to like linger with him. There's no music swell, there's no anything. It's just like boom, boom, out.
Yeah.
And as an audience, we're going, what?
Yeah.
And even in the end, when he takes down the senator and his mother, there's a bit of a moment, but not like a more modern Hollywood way of like. And when they're hit, they're done. Like Angela Lansbury doesn't get like a death scene. It's just gone. And then we are immediately back up in there with him and Sinatra.
And we deal with the emotional ramifications of what he's just done, which is kind of what the movie is, right? There aren't any moments to like rest on anything cinematically. It's all very like, because that's what violence is. It's fast and hard hitting, and then life moves on far too quickly, right? Wow, we really jumped around the movie, didn't we? We jumped all the way to the end, didn't we?
That's what we did.
That's how it works.
So John Frankenheimer, the director, so one of his first films, and he came from television. That's where you kind of get that hard-hitting, the editing style, like, let's tell the story
economically. That's why the press
economically.
conference is so effective.
Yes. And he had a run, like in 1960 to 1976, where it was like, this was his wheelhouse, like a political thriller. I believe, so he did 7 Days in May, then he does Seconds, and he's so good at, one, he's kind of rolling around in the muck of his time, so he's telling these political stories, and he's doing kind of like a wink to the audience of like, isn't it so crazy what's going on? Here's how we could spin it. And this film it's kind of like looking at Dr. Strangelove now, where you're like, back then, it's like, isn't this so ridiculous? And now we look at it and we're like,
it's happening right
now.
now.
Right. Yeah.
But no, clearly an efficient director and a director that knows where to put the camera. And every time, like, there's so many different shots and so many different angles in this movie where it's just like, oh, it's just so right there. There's no place else there it could be. And there's so many scenes that are so effective. And one of them at the end, so we're jumping around, so we're going to jump to the end now. But the speech that Sinatra gives to Harvey is, like, there's no doubt that this is Frank Sinatra's best performance ever. And he knew, it's like he knew that at the time, so he's just like, oh, this is the one thing that I've done.
Yeah.
And at the end of the movie, his shots are out of focus. They're very soft.
Yeah.
And it's long disputed, like, he saw that and was like, what the hell, this is my best performance and it's out of focus. Why is it out of focus? And Frankenheimer maintains that he did that on purpose because, it's Harvey's point of view.
Yeah.
And he's, his mind is out of focus.
Right.
So that's why he did it. But from Sinatra and, actors let you know, he's just like, come on, like, this is a mistake, this doesn't happen.
And that was the first take. They did a second take and it wasn't as good. So Frankenheimer
it's
goes
all
with the first
over,
one.
and we get the shot of him standing there. It's in crystal clear focus. It's like, oh, right. But, yeah, I mean, I wondered that too. Like, I looked into it too, and it does seem like what I noticed even before that scene was, looking at it cinematically, was it was not the only shot that was out of focus, and it wasn't just like it's the most the most I don't know, the most obvious
Right.
version of that because he's the only thing in the frame.
Right.
But there are a lot of shots like that where it's like, okay, they didn't have the depth of field, or they had this depth of field thing where something's happening in the foreground and something's happening in the background, and they want you to be paying attention to the thing that's coming toward the camera in the background. So the guy in the foreground, like for instance, one of the very first things we see, the interpreter, out there at night, and they're all come trucking through the mud to get to him, and he's like, his face is out of focus. And there's a bunch of those sort of things throughout the film. So I didn't really feel like, I mean, it's definitely very noticeable in that one scene because it's like locked on him, and but it didn't take me out of it because it did feel like, oh, this is this guy's meltdown,
Yeah.
and this is probably what he's seeing, and so. You could make the case, I mean, who knows? Maybe he just said, well, that was the best take. I accidentally shot it out of focus, but emotionally it works for the film, right?
And I I don't know if it was Frankenheimer like in the moment being like, oh no, I totally did that on purpose,
Yeah, right.
just to cover his butt.
Yeah. Calm Frank down.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Anybody else a little disappointed that it's black and white? For only the reason that it's Frank Sinatra? And he's got those blue eyes that we don't get to see? Yeah. I mean, the first time he comes on camera, I'm just like, but I can't see his eyes.
That's why he's so good.
That's probably why.
They pierce through
right.
all
it's
color.
Like, it's like Paul Newman, you can.
That's true.
He had to act well because people couldn't swoon at his blue eyes. Yeah, he had something.
No, there are a lot of moments in the film that are very, I mean, this is going to sound weird because of the content of the movie, but there's a lot of strange moments, like his conversation with Janet Leigh on the train.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was going to mention that one too. Yeah.
There's a lot of discussion about that scene.
And it's so, like, because you're just like, what are you guys talking about?
Yeah.
Like, this is so strange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even she thought so.
Yeah.
She's like, Vivian Leigh, or Janet Leigh, has said that this is one of the hardest roles for her because her characters just kind of drop down in the middle of it, and then she just speaks in non sequiturs for the whole time.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, her and Sinatra are in love, and she's like, I mean, it works, and it was challenging, and it was great to work on, but it was really hard to just be like, oh, I'm going to come in and I'm going to talk about a bunch of random stuff with you.
And is the dispute that, like, she's
His handler. The way that Angela Lansbury is Raymond's handler.
Yeah.
So that what she's saying are, code phrases and things like that.
Well, I will say, I love that scene, and at the end, specifically, I never took it that way. I never took it that I just took it as like, this is kind of a sassy woman who's like intrigued by how by this broken man in front of her, and she's trying jokes at the beginning, and they're not landing because he's not listening, and then by the end, she's just giving him everything he needs for later, because she knows that this is not going to go anywhere right now.
Yeah.
And when she gives him her address and phone number, it's so awesome to see, like she says the thing, and then she says, "Do you understand?" And he says yes, in a very like brainwashed way.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's like the same performance he gives, and everyone else in the film gives every time someone asks them, "Do you understand?" when they're brainwashing them.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't think she was brainwashing him. I thought, oh, he's so programmed that when someone like hands him a bunch of information and says, "Do you understand?" he's programmed to say yes,
I do.
like a robot. And I just was watching his face turn that way, and those are the kind of little subtle details that they really put the actor sort of first and foremost. And there's such naturalistic acting in this film compared to every other film of its age, where everything feels like forced and staged. And
right.
The performances in those two films, and they're only, what was Strangelove?
64.
So that's 2 years later.
Yeah.
And it's so much bigger and so stagey. And this is, I mean, he's scared. He's standing in that vestibule, and he's losing his mind.
Yeah, I mean, there are moments when I'm like, oh, well, that's obviously that's very theatrical, or that's a little bit over the top or something. But I just feel like many films of that age, you can't even get through a scene because you're just so busy thinking about. You can practically see them reading the lines to each other in their heads, And it doesn't feel that way. It feels like the director really wanted to push the camera up to this person and make them feel that emotion, and you really feel it.
And that's why it feels so modern, and it feels like a film that could come out today and be shot the same way and feel the same way. And there's directors today that I feel like constantly go back to it and are constantly influenced by it. The funny way is Ben Stiller with Zoolander.
Right.
Totally hates this movie. But Quentin Tarantino just from a tonal aspect of how he deals with the violence and how he deals with a story that kind of drifts in and out of different tones. But the best example is when Frank Sinatra comes to the door, opens it, the interpreter is there, and they go into the fight. That is shot for shot a scene, the opening scene between Uma Thurman and Vivica A. Fox in Kill Bill.
Shot for shot, really?
Because the door opens, sees the interpreter, and then it pushes it on his face, and then they just launch into this fight, and they're like, they're breaking the room apart and everything.
That was the only scene in the movie that I felt like, oh, this shows its age a little bit. Like, it's so clunky. The whole thing is so clunky. It reminds me of some of the early Bond movies where before they got fast with the editing and fast and realistic with the fight choreography, it feels very like
ham-fisted haymaker,
a little corny,
judo chop,
and it's Frank Sinatra doing karate, and you're like, what?
Yeah. You kind of expect like one of those comic bubbles to pop up and say, "Kapow!"
Yeah. This is one of the first films to feature martial arts. As well.
Yeah,
which is kind of cool.
Also, it sort of takes you out of it that like they do a pretty decent job of hiring some Asian actors for this movie, but this is not one of them. This is an Italian actor portraying an Asian actor, which that's that is of its time. Also, like the other thing we haven't talked about, I can't believe we're half an hour in and we haven't talked about this yet, but how recent this feels after McCarthyism. To like tear apart McCarthyism in this cartoonish way and this satirical way, so soon after that, like practically tore the country apart, is remarkable to me.
Because you really only will get that from comedy and Hollywood in general, where it's like, oh, remember that thing last week? Well, we're going to tear it apart. But you're right, it is pretty recent after all of that to just be like, well,
especially
now we're going to
in a time frame when that wasn't really done, when like movies and movies weren't really about that. That's not what they're for. They were escapism to get away from that stuff. They weren't pointing a finger at it.
Ushering into the middle to late 60s and 70s where they become
more of a revolution,
satirical and a political.
For lack of a better word, there's an irreverence to this movie that is, that is not of its time, and. It's like right after McCarthyism, it's being shot during the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then a year later, JFK is assassinated. So it's like there's so much going on in this, and this film is just like right in the middle of it. And one of the other things is that at the rally at the end, I love, you can tell that they just showed up at a real rally and shot it. And there's like this documentary type footage that's mixed in with Frank Sinatra running in, and you can tell that there's actors staged as extras, but then they mix in this kind of like this documentary footage, whether they
shot it or not,
stole it or not. But that also feels like no, this is happening right now, and you get that hysteria about it, and there was probably no other way for them to get away with that, or for them to even deal with that, without having that darkly comic tone to it, or without feeling like this is so ridiculous that I don't know how I can take it seriously. But then he just intersperses all of these different moments where it's like there's no other way to take it but seriously. It's so compelling.
Yeah, and he does such a good job. Isley does such a good job of just that buffoonish, over the top. I mean, McCarthy was over the top anyway, but he really does take like kind of the worst aspects of it and like they heighten it to a point. It does feel a little strange lovey in that like even though it preceded it, that they're taking this sort of archetype that has been created, the sort of boob in public life, and turning it up to 11, and then to find out, oh, guess what? There's also someone controlling that puppet behind the scenes, and it's
We've talked about this before because it seems like every time like we'll pick a movie and we'll sit down and we'll watch it and be like, oh my God, like this is just like now. But I don't know. I've had this argument before where it's like, should I feel optimistic that they felt this way in 62? Should I take some comfort in the fact that maybe this doesn't feel as bad as it is, but no, it feels bad.
So, in other words, like you look back on it and you think like, oh, this is them processing something they thought was terrible.
Right, like now, like everything feels just so apocalyptic and so awful and so
And it did back then, and we got through it. Is that what you're saying?
Right. Yeah. Right. Like, you know, in the conversations I have with my parents, it's like, no, just don't worry. Like, you know,
Figure it out.
we went through this too back when, you know, Kennedy and Nixon. Like, don't worry. Like, we'll be fine. And I'm like, I'm not going to be fine.
I've been listening to something about the Nixon impeachment and or the Nixon, you know, resigning, and it's remarkable. I had no idea. There's like 2 years in there.
Yeah.
Where Watergate was just like seen as and presented as like, oh, it's no big deal. That stuff happens all the time.
Right.
No one took it seriously. It took 2 years for people to start taking it seriously to the point where they were willing to do something about it. So it's interesting to think about it in that context because you just think, oh, Nixon, Watergate, resign.
Yeah,
You know.
it feels like it was this happened, resignation. It's like, no, this happened. Nobody cared for a long time. And then people started putting pieces together and were like, actually, this goes really deep and far.
Well, and there were people on the front lines in the media who were trying to get it to be something that people took seriously because people, you know, they just made it seem like it was no big deal and it was, you know, and there were media outlets treating it that way and the public. And
a little bit of a digression, but that is what is that's what's interesting about rewatching All the President's Men is that you think that like at the end of that movie there's a triumph to them getting the story, and it's like that wasn't the thing.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Yeah.
Okay, we've come this far. We can't go any further without talking about Angela Lansbury.
I know.
And
how have we not talked
amazing
about it yet? And the fact that she's like 3 years younger than the
older.
Yes.
She's only 3 years older than her son.
Than her son in the movie. She's amazing.
Like, it could have been Lucille Ball.
It could have been Lucille Ball.
That's who Sinatra wanted.
That's a whole other movie.
That's one of those things where it's like, well, it's like, oh, that would have been amazing too, just because it's Lucille Ball saying these awful things. But I don't know, like Angela Lansbury, man, like forget about Murder, She Wrote. Like, she is there, and there's such a coldness to everything that she says.
Yeah.
And you think that, like, even for thinking back over 1962, it's like, oh my God, like this must have been, like, of course she, you know, was revered and given all of these critical accolades and getting all these awards because, I mean, just, you know, there's such a feast that she has with all of these lines and all of these things that she gets to do. But watching it today, you're just like, oh man, like it still stings. And you know, like when she's talking about the interpreter and she's like, Ching Chow Chu, like whatever your name is, you're just like, God.
Yeah, she's
something else. And
it's like hanging out with a racist grandma and you're just like, don't.
But she's got so much power, you know, and so and she wields it in a way that feels like, I don't know, there's just something so, she's in this package that everyone else from the outside just looks like, come on, babe. She's like a trophy on, you know, his arm, and she wields that as a weapon because then
she's
behind the scenes she's doing everything. Yeah, right. She is Lady Macbeth, and she's so terrifying when you start to when you see. And of course, it's no big surprise when they do sort of like they just sort of tease you about like who is his American handler, and then when she finally says like, you know, let's get out of have a game of solitaire or whatever, you know.
And her because yes, like at first you just think like, oh, she's just a overbearing, overpowering mother,
and a political wife.
Yes,
she just gets progressively worse and worse and worse.
Yes, and that turn, like, you know, of all the speeches from this era, like, you know, and they will, it's like they'll pay for how contemptuously they underestimated me.
Right.
And you hear that line, and you're just like, ugh.
Yeah.
I mean, this is Batman villain stuff.
Yeah.
Well, what's crazy about that moment to me was that it's not just that she's working for the other side, and she's making all this happen so that they can have control over the U.S. government. It's also that she's very angry at them for doing this to her son, and therefore there's a phase 2 we're not even going to see, where she's going to take her revenge on all these people who have done this to her, which is the level of diabolical, you know, it's incredible.
It's a lot.
And you believe it. Like, she makes it so, for someone who was, I don't know, how old was she?
38? 36.
I mean, for someone, an actor that relatively young, I just, to have that sort of gravity and weight to everything she did, you know, and to do it as this character who's supposed to be the mother and the wife and the, you know, it's just incredible. It's an incredible, like, balancing act that she, as an actor, has to walk, I think.
And because she could go way over the top and be like, stroke your beard, maniacal.
Yeah, right.
But the most sinister thing she does physically is smoke a cigarette. That's it. Otherwise, it's just the delivery of her lines and all of her internalized intentions coming out and just being so scary.
And the loaded, that kiss.
Right.
That is just like that extra thing where it's just like, what else is going on underneath the surface there?
Yeah.
But also
that's pared down from the novel where that they have a full-on incestuous relationship. Like there's a sex scene that was cut.
I'm so glad that they didn't.
Because they're like, this will never get past the censors. Right. Also, ew.
Yeah, we'll do blood on the wall, but we won't do that.
Yeah.
It's also that line and that turn for her is also, it's scary now because like you think of all the political things and all of the things that happen in the world of politics that affect so many people. And to think that it's just because of revenge.
Yeah.
It's just because of ego.
Right. Right.
And that is the one thing.
And you see those things happening now as well, and you're just like, oh my God.
Well, and you think like how there's so many things that I don't know. Like how much worse is it? Right. Underneath the surface.
If this is a plausible scenario that could happen, which seems like it is. I mean, the brainwashing, maybe not, but all of like the undercutting of each other and the attempts to usurp different people through various means, that happens all the time. You hear about it all the time. Oh, this country just overthrew their ruler, or this happened, and this person. It's terrifying.
I mean, it's a whole different. I'm assuming we're not going to go too deeply into the political fray of what's happening right now.
No.
But there are just it does. You do see some parallels, and while brainwashing your enemy and making them do things is not something that we necessarily take seriously in this day and age. There are other ways in, and that we're seeing now. There's a whole. I was listening to a radio thing the other day about an entire building, in Russia where people are just creating,
social media
stuff for Americans to see. So there are other ways in, and then the question is like, how highly is your enemy able to place their own operative within your government, right? And so it's hard not to ask yourself that question in this day and age, watching a film like this, seeing what's going on right now. Obviously it's not going to be Angela Lansbury in the White House with the brainwashing, but it might be somebody else with the spam
on the Facebook. I mean,
exactly.
Social media is the new brainwashing. You'll take literally anything you see on Facebook as gospel truth, and then you share it.
I didn't think
about, you're like, oh, that's
I didn't think
news.
about social media as brainwashing, but you can make that link too.
Possible.
But also,
well, I read it from CNN. Well, that's not really CNN.
But the other thing I wanted to mention is just like you mentioned really early on, the Hitchcock connection here, obviously Janet Leigh, but also Mom's a Monster, which is another Hitchcock theme, and the low angles and the high angles and the fact that it feels like a play, but more. It has a lot of those themes to it, and maybe it's that TV director, on the cutting edge of the '60s, showing people scary, suspenseful things they hadn't seen before thing. But I don't know. I don't know anything about whether the director had more ties than.
Well, Frankenheimer actually he directed some episodes of Alfred Hitchcock Presents.
Okay.
So there's that, but then like it's like every director in the '60s and the '70s was looking at Hitchcock and being like, how can I be? If I'm doing a thriller, there's only one place I'm going to look for inspiration. But yeah, I mean, I didn't even put together the Monstrous Mother, but of course.
Something I just thought about in this conversation is the symbolism within the costume party. He's dressed up as Abraham Lincoln, who was famously assassinated. She's dressed up as a shepherd girl, and I think Raymond's a cowboy or something. I don't even really remember what his costume is.
He makes a joke about it. That's his one joke, right? About how he looks like Groucho Marx or something. But it looks almost more like a, I don't know, Mexican cowboy or something. I don't know.
But the two of them, the assassinated president and a shepherd. Didn't even realize it until this moment.
Also, the reveal that she's the Queen of Hearts.
I had a couple of things when I was watching this, and I was like, oh, come on. And because that's going to happen in every movie, but it's so realistic, not realistic, but it's so, you buy into so much that happens in this movie as you're watching it. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Like, if you buy into the idea that these guys were brainwashed, then everything else is like pretty realistic. Yeah. Except I had 3 things. The relationship between Frank Sinatra's character and Janet Leigh's character, that is so, I mean, it is so odd. I love their meet cute, if you want to call it that, meet freak. But it is like the relationship, the fact that it takes off that quickly. She breaks off an engagement and moves in with him because he called her, which is very convenient for the storyline. The accident that happens where the bartender accidentally says the solitaire line and then he walks into the lake, you need that for the story. But like the fact that he just happened to say, so I said to him, why don't you pass the time by playing a little solitaire? Who says that? Nobody in real life says that, unless that was some kind of weird test or whatever. And the last one was the fact that she comes in, the girl comes in wearing the Queen of Diamonds costume, which is like, unless that was a plant, which it doesn't look like it was in the story or whatever.
She's just like, oh, I saw it in the store window. Because she said, oh,
past the costume shop. Okay, you passed the costume shop. No, it wasn't even a Queen of Hearts costume, it was a Queen of Diamonds costume. How convenient that that's your trigger card.
Right.
Those are the things that like took me out of it. And I like, oh, come on. Like, she leaves him in the room for 2 seconds and suddenly a girl with a Queen of Diamonds costume walks in.
And from the patio.
But that doesn't end up triggering him, right? That's a red herring.
Yes.
Because you see it and you're like, oh my God.
Okay, okay.
Because Sinatra's already been to us and deactivated.
Somehow I thought that like that launched him out of it. Like he was in a trance until she came in and then he saw the card and like, right? Am I wrong? And like does a double take and then is able to like leave with her because Angela Lansbury puts him in that room and takes the queen so that he can't do anything, leaves him in the trance. I don't know. I could be wrong. Anyway, point is, it's a pretty perfect movie, but those things were like, oh, I don't know about that. That and the Sicilian Asian guy, I think were my biggest problems. But
I was a little confused by Henry Silva as Korean interpreter as myself.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think it says something about this film and about the direction of this film that, you know, that brainwashing was such a science fiction type idea at that time, and is now too. But that doesn't, you know, the House of Cards does not crumble because of the movie does not crumble because of that.
Right.
Like because of how jarring that flashback is done, like that almost just like puts you right into it right away and doesn't even give you a chance to say like, well, that's ridiculous.
Right.
Because it just goes.
There's something about like, they're making a movie sort of about PTSD, or at the time shell shock, or whatever they called it then. And you know, to the average moviegoer, like we hadn't seen war footage from Vietnam yet, and so that they don't have necessarily, I would assume the audience wouldn't have like as much of a frame of reference for what soldiers go through in battle, and what they go through, certainly not when they come home from battle. And so, you know, they come home and they're expected to, you know, have a parade and go back to their lives, right? So now we're seeing men waking up in a cold sweat in their bed at night and these weird dreams they're having. And the whole movie is about, you know, mental distress, mental illness. And so to introduce this sort of heightened idea of like, what if you took people who are very vulnerable mentally and you were able to work, you know, their mind, you know, to your will? You kind of buy that because it's you see these very vulnerable soldiers who have been through a lot, and you know, and then you see the enemy manipulating that. It just seems like, I don't know, I kind of buy it as a moviegoer because I feel like, oh, this is, you know, they're just taking something that, you know, they're taking this mental vulnerability and they're just expanding on what's possible from it.
And that, you know, there's one way you can look at it and say, well, they're using a real distress of people for dramatic effect. But that this was the one film that we had to actually show that and to actually show the horrors of that is pretty remarkable and kind of takes away from that type of criticism. But yeah, like after World War II, it's like people came back and they just did not know what to do. And they didn't even really have a name for it or a way to deal with it. It was more like, you know, they saw a doctor and they said, snap out of it.
Yeah, right.
And it's, you know, the 40s. you're a man.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to talk about it.
Yeah.
Right. Before we were even talking, we were talking about, this is a huge tangent, but they redid Queer Eye on Netflix. And the strongest thing about that is the conversations that they have with the guys about their backgrounds and being able to be comfortable talking about their feelings. So this is...
We're still having a problem with it.
Yeah, it's never... toxic masculinity, it sucks. But this is that. It's like, okay, well, if we don't do anything about these guys, someone else is going to take advantage of that and use it against us.
This is that, and it's Harry Potter.
Yeah.
It's both things.
Queer Eye, Harry Potter. That's what I'm bringing to the table, guys. Yes. It made me think about things you would hear about happening at Guantanamo Bay with the torture and everything there. It's like, this isn't gone. This idea of
unfortunately
taking a prisoner and manipulating to the point of them changing sides without their knowledge. So, I mean, this was 50 years ago, and it's still happening. I mean, I think Jennifer Lawrence has a movie coming out that's that same kind of thing where she's like a sleeper agent.
Red Sparrow.
Yeah. And then The Americans is kind of the same thing, but they're cognizant of what they're doing.
Oh, good show.
It seems like there's so much that could be done today, and there's so much that this film could influence today. And I was thinking about that when I was thinking about the show and the things that we were going to talk about, like, you know, over the course of the 3 years that I was writing Northland and struggling with it, like this film came up a lot, and we would talk about it. And you know, it is a film that just deals with so many different things, and it feels like it doesn't have to be a remake. It could just be a different spin on this story. And there's like so much over the course of 15, 20 years that could be used for that. And that's what I'm kind of excited about, for someone to actually do that.
Yeah, right. Like, it's like you can take a Shakespeare play and you can drop it down in any in any time or place, or you can create, you know, something based on the story of the Shakespeare play that's of that time, right?
Yeah.
Bring It On? No, what's the one?
10 Things I Hate About You.
10 Things I Hate About You, there you go. But yeah, like the remake thing was fine, right? If you're gonna like change a few of the details and try to force it into that time period. Kind of like the Ethan Hawke Hamlet when he worked at a corporation or whatever. But then there's like, yeah, it would be cool to see somebody take some of the stuff in this movie and make an independent, like an actual movie.
Just take the elements of it.
Yeah.
This, and this. It's kind of like it's an homage to. It's inspired by.
Why don't we do it, guys? You want to do it?
Yeah.
Great. We can do it in this room. We can have the circular.
Yeah. We just have to find 20 people. Where can we find 20 people?
20 women. It's interesting that it's women, right? Like that was like one of the things that's like.
That's what takes you out of it.
Right. But
when it first starts.
But the use of it.
Yeah. Are you talking about the garden party stuff? Yeah.
Yeah. But that in some way that it was, you know, trying to. I mean, I guess it's because Angela Lansbury ends up being the handler. Is that like the kind of like the tip of the, like, trying to tip its hat in like terms of like.
Yeah. Oh, I hadn't thought of that, but yeah.
Manipulating.
But it is yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am, yes, ma'am.
Right.
I think a part of it was, it's just so much more effective to have someone who's, you know, we know that they're standing in a room full of these communists and that they're being brainwashed, and to have that person stand in the middle of a room like that and keep saying yes, ma'am to a large man with a mustache is, you know, that really tells the audience, like, in no uncertain terms, this man is not in his right mind.
Right. It's also emasculating.
And then there's the authority thing, you know, and the fact that, you know, it's sort of like they all, you know, they're all soldiers, they're all used to paying attention to authority, but they're all also polite young American men, and they're all used to tipping their hat for an old lady. And so they kind of swap one thing out for the other in those scenes where every time he gives them an order, you know, even when he is about to strangle the guy, and he says, now, just sit back. Oh, yes, ma'am. You know, and it's like, rather than yes, sir, it's a smile, polite, yes, ma'am. But it was an interesting like swap that they did there. But I think it's really effective. You know, I don't think it says anything. I think Angela Lansbury says more about like women are monsters than that does. I think that is more of a device to get you to see exactly how, because it's so tame. What's happening in the garden party is so tame.
And it's effective because the soldiers in the brainwashing would never question that. I mean, it's weird that we're here, but yeah, whatever. Yeah, but if it were like a bunch of men sitting around, then they would participate. But since it's women talking about flowers and stuff, they're just like...
Well, cinematically, it needs to be as different as possible.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, if you're writing this movie, you have to, or the book or whatever, you have to have this okay, there has to be an excuse for a lot of people in one room, and it has to be as cinematically, diametrically opposed to what's actually happening as possible. Right. So you have all these aggressive men in these bleachers versus all these very polite little old ladies in the garden party, right?
Yeah. Speaking of the speech that the woman is giving at the beginning of that party about the flowers, they just copied it verbatim from a seed catalog.
Right, of course they did.
It's I don't know.
And all those psychological studies that he talks about are all real too.
Oh yeah.
And we haven't really talked about the fact that we see that whole scene with African American actors as well, which is such an interesting spin that in his brain they've managed to make it that.
Yeah, it's just well, it was probably just women, and him being an African American himself, he's like, okay, but black women.
It's one of the rare instances where I was of a movie made that long ago with something centering around race that doesn't feel overtly racist.
Yeah, they're not look at this. I mean, it's just
the Sicilian playing the Asian guy felt overtly racist. Yeah. But the room full of black people instead of white people didn't feel that way. It felt because we are inside his mind.
It's just a shift in
and this is what he sees a garden party as, although they did drop a scene. Did you guys read about that? That they dropped a little clip. Apparently, that scene had a white servant in it, waiting on all the black ladies at the party, an inverted. And they were like, that's just going to cause too much controversy. We'll just cut that out. Yeah. And you could argue also that it has no value
purpose.
Because that is not obviously what he would envision if he was.
That's yeah. A couple things of trivia before we wrap this.
Trivia. Can we talk about the cost of the movie? Is that in there?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
This movie cost $2.2 million.
Where the money went?
$1 million of it went to Sinatra.
That's incredible.
$200,000 of it went to Lawrence Harvey.
And the rest?
The rest went to the movie.
That's crazy to think that they made this movie with that amount of money.
Yeah. They made it with the same amount of money they paid him just to be in it. That's crazy to me.
Iceland's plane in the film is actually Sinatra's personal plane. This film was blocked in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Finland, and Sweden until the fall of the Soviet Union in 1993.
You've made a good movie
when half of Russia or half of Europe won't watch it. Yeah. Joe Adams plays the army psychologist in the film. He's the first black actor cast in a role that isn't significantly or specifically a black actor. It's just army psychologist, and he got the part based on talent. So good job, Frankenheimer. Filming began each day after 11 a.m. because Sinatra was unable to go to sleep before 5 a.m.
Because he's unable or unwilling. Was he doing gigs?
I think it was...
I read that all his scenes were filmed at the beginning of that. He did them all.
He shot everything first.
Scrammed.
And then he demanded to have final approval on all of his scenes, and then the black and white, or the out of focus thing came up, and it was a big point of contention. There's a lot of disagreement as to why the film disappeared from distribution. A lot of people think it's because he specifically asked Kennedy to make this movie because he's like, I don't want you to feel uncomfortable with this, with the subject matter and the assassination. Kennedy contacted the president of United Artists and was like, go for it, I really like the book, I think this could be great. Then the assassination happens, and the film kind of disappeared for a while. And that was, from what I read, purely because of neglect on Sinatra's part, because after '73, the rights reverted back to him because he was a producer on it, and then he just kind of didn't put it out there.
I'm sure people didn't really want to see it, right?
It's a lot when the president's just been shot to
and then his brother
think about it again.
And it's also like it's disputed between whether or not he said no, pull it, Kennedy's just been shot, or if it was just that was just the normal run of the film and it just dropped out. From
what I read, it was the latter. Let's see. This film used a lot of handheld cameras to get those disturbing shots, like the Dutch angle on Sinatra when he has the newspaper and it pushes in on. You can tell that that's handheld. And there's a lot of like movement in the apartments that isn't smooth, which gives it that kind of like voyeur in the room, tripping over stuff kind of feel. Jamie Lee Curtis said in an interview for Turner Classic Movies that Janet Leigh was served divorce papers on set from Tony Curtis in this movie, which is just mean.
Is that where, so, and then Sinatra does the same thing to Mia Farrow on Rosemary's Baby.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Oh, guys.
Oh, jeez. The only thing I had in my notes that we didn't talk about was music.
Yeah.
Which is so beautiful. Like there's this sort of like two types of music in the movie. There's like that sort of horn, like very just sort of beautiful, almost military style horn music that's sort of ballady. And that's kind of, you know, moves everything along when everything's going fine. And then there's this very dissonant kind of like off the wall music that plays every time something crazy's going down.
Right.
And especially that for the first time you hear it is like that garden party thing. It's like harpsichord, but it's all very dissonant. And it's funny because you're watching a bunch of little old ladies talk about seeds, and if you put any other music, normal major chord music underneath that, it would seem very innocuous.
Yeah.
You know, and the fact that this weird like dystopian harpsichord music is playing,
It puts you
like,
on edge.
something's
and then
going
you're
on.
like,
I don't know what, but
why is this scene creepy? It's just ladies talking about flowers.
But it really does. They really do a marvelous job of using music to kind of like shift the tone of the film as you're going along and put you in the mindset of it. There's so much of that, like with the camera angles and the camera movements and the music and the editing. It's all really intended to put you closer to the people who are suffering from this problem. And that's just an incredible feat to me for something that was made so long ago, and so many other films in that same time period seem so removed and so like, let's lock down the camera out here and here's how the play, and it's like shooting a play or whatever from a wide angle.
This feels like something that you're living.
Yeah, or then the cuts between them. You know, a lot of times those old films feel like when you cut to someone's close-up, it feels very much like, okay, and now here's the close-up, and they're like overacting in the close-up, and then they're cutting it. It's very obvious that there were two separate takes, and you know, it just all feels so fluid and so visceral in this film.
We talked about this last week with Midnight Cowboy, but it's like, you know, there's movies that you watch and you're like, okay, I'm watching a movie, I'm participating in a story that's being told to me, and then there's other movies like Midnight Cowboy where you're like, no, I'm watching something that's really happening.
Right.
And this feels like a movie that, you know, is made in an era where it's like, we make movies. We make the, you know, stand back, look at the big Vista Panavision, and let's separate ourselves.
We're still making musicals at this point.
And that, like, this is like the first time where it's like, you know, I want to put you inside the psychology of these characters, and I want to make it feel like it's really happening.
Final thoughts.
Good movie.
Beautiful. Good movie. If you haven't seen it, we ruined it for you. So.
Yeah, that's the nature of the show. Also, it came out in 1962. It's on you.
Plenty of
yeah, I loved it. I thought it was really, really fantastic. It makes me want to watch the remake just to see how they do, but I already know that it's not going to be anything like this.
No. And again, like, you know, we chose it to screen at Main Street Landing for that purpose of, it's like, you know, let's pick a movie that kind of feels relevant now or from back then. Where you watch it and you're like, oh, this has the same this has the same power, if not maybe even more power now, based on everything that's going down. And it, you know, if I'm ever going to make a case, it's like, why watch a movie from 1962 or even beyond? Why watch classic films? Here's like, you know, one of the 5 movies that I would say, like, you know, there's a reason you should keep watching classic films, because, you know, this is a movie that's still relevant and still influential and still knocks your socks off when you see it.
Totally.
Nathan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.
Where can people find you online if you wish to be found? And where can they find the comedy club goings on?
Yeah, they should check out the Vermont Comedy Club. We have shows there all the time.
Yeah.
That's it.
BT Comedy.
Guys, I'm going to pass some time by playing a little song.
Oh, no!
Oh, my God.
He brought props. What if you pulled? What if you pulled?
This is not solitaire. This is something else.
This is. I got a jack.
All right.
Dun, 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 dun.
Oh, you found it.
Great. David's gonna go murder somebody.
It's not a stacked deck or anything.
Cool. What do we got next week?
Next week we have Days of Heaven with Devin.
Devin Ewalt coming back on the show.
Devin with Heaven.
Heaven with
Days of Heaven with Devin.
7 minutes with Heaven and Devin. Okay.
Exactly. Thank you again, Nathan. Thank you, David.
Thanks, guys.
And thank you to everybody who came out to the screening tonight. It's going to go great. We're going to be awesome. Until next time, I'm Lincoln L. Hayes.
I'm David Metzger.
I'm Nathan Hartswick.
Go to the Comedy Club and watch movies separate from each other.